Dwarf armies are possibly one of the most interesting armies that a fantasy universe can actually have, as they have very great many interesting possibilities for dwarf machinery, of long-ranged weapons like bombards or cannons, of medium-ranged bow and crossmen, as well as a strong bulk of infantrymen that can hold the line against much tougher and bigger enemies. And if you want to see how a good dwarven fantasy army actually looks like, then check out my full-length companion video about the Dwarf Army in Overlord. It's linked down in the video description. So, how would a realistic dwarf army even look like? Well, in order to answer this, we need to take a look at the question of what the dwarves even have available to them, and what they can build from, where they can recruit from, and finally what kind of mercenaries and auxiliary troops they could hire or otherwise acquire. And we are going to use the classical dwarf template here. The dwarves are shorter than men, but weight way more than them. They are stronger, they have problems fighting in warmer humid environments due to body heat issues, their beards protect their more sensitive front ends, and they are great miners and tunneling experts, as well as resistant to cold weather, due to their low surface to body mass ratio and their general bulk and hairiness. And the first thing I have to note is that in a society where nearly everybody is working with potentially deadly weapons, such as hammers or pickaxes, as well as a society where there is no strict division between farmers, laborers and city folk, since all dwarves live relatively close in their underground halls, with some being smiths, some miners, some construction workers and some carpenters. But this general presence of physical labor and the closeness and company, in combination with the concept of dwarven honor, should and likely would make the dwarven society, and therefore the armies, incredibly cohesive and unified. Dwarves would also be hard to rout, since nobody wants to lose their honor, in front of hundreds, if not thousands of dwarves, by displaying cowardice, or something on the likes of this. And this is why I believe that dwarves would actually have two armies, since every dwarf basically carries and has experience with a deadly weapon, such as a hammer or a pickaxe, but is unlikely to turn these weapons on his peers, for fear of losing his face in front of all of them, as well as being only tasked with defending their homes, their tunnels, their riches, their wives, their kids, and their very mountains. They can be relied upon to do their duties as probably one of the most reliable types of militias in their respective fantasy universes. Every single dwarven city could convert, if necessary, a huge portion of their men and women into fighters, since every dwarf would be affected if the mountain would be lost, as in his family needs to flee at the very least. And if the mountain can be attacked, then it is also likely surrounded. And even a normal dwarven militiaman, a miner for example, will likely have a far higher morale and fight far more eagerly than the poor human knight that has to peel the dwarves out of their entrenchments. And since dwarves are very slow and very vulnerable in the warmer flatlands, they wouldn't likely flee because they know their chances to actually get away are slim to non-existent. And therefore the basic infantry unit of this militia, this home defense force, would be the militiaman, armed and armored with whatever he can find, acquire or forge at that time. He would most likely have at least a pickaxe or a hammer, as well as some sort of shield and at the very least something akin to a helmet, even if it is just a pan or pot, wrapped into multiple layers of cloths, in order to lessen any blunt damage. And since there would be still a lot of blacksmiths running around, these pots could be quite quickly reforged into more proper helmets, since dwarves needs to keep supply ready in case they are snowed in, and since nobody really can surprise the dwarves since they sit atop of a literal mountain, and therefore any large force would be noticed way in advance. And since many empty mineshafts are cool and stable in temperature, the dwarves could also not only have firewood and food in great amounts at sight, but basically anything else they would need to forge more weapons and armor. So any dwarf militia force would get better over time, because they will quite literally craft their own armor and proper weapons. Which means any attacking force would either need to lay siege for multiple years, which buys the main army of the dwarves the time necessary to return home and break the siege, along with the bodies of whoever had lain siege to their homes in the first place. Or they need to quickly rush in. And even then dwarves, who would be major arms supplier in this world, would be able to quickly grab some sword and some armament for their customers for self-defense purposes. Now, armor meant for human is unlikely to fit the dwarves, but their swords could still be wielded, as well as their spears and perhaps their shields, all depending on how big the grip is. Furthermore, the dwarven militiamen would be led by retired war veterans, so there would be a great amount of experience, likely centuries worth of, leading such an rather inexperienced force. Older veterans, guards, and whoever else can fight would also join in, and since dwarven women are very similar to dwarven men, and since they also have beards, they would also be more or less within the army, and they would also be more or less a proper match for the average human. So they would also join in the defense at large numbers. Finally, every single dwarven militiaman would also be able to do basic ranged combat, since they have the higher ground, this most valuable of places, and even if they just fling a rock, something that dwarves in the mountains should have a very, very high supply of, they, due to the height advantage, or rather the height advantage of the mountain, would outrange pretty much any crossbowman and any archer. It would need siege artillery in order to outrange them, and dwarves would also likely have these very own weapons as well. For example, a dwarven underground city could have a ballista or a trebuchet at its very peak, or rather below the peak, stored away in some great rooms nearby the entrance in order to protect this valuable machine from the harsh mountain climate. And finally, while the dwarven militiamen can't just lift up gigantic boulders in order to throw them down at their enemies, they don't need to. All they need to do is give prepared boulders a firm push, in order to then start an avalanche that would then plow through whatever is climbing up the mountain. And finally dwarves would be at least able to rest in their homes, sleep in their beds, eat their own food, and enjoy their family and their familiar climate, while whoever is attacking has to climb up the mountain while being peppered with rocks, arrows, siege artillery, and boulders, through the harsh mountain climate and the thin air. Unlikely meager rations. So the defenders would most likely be more determined and have better morale than the professional army trying to conquer them. And even if the attackers make it to the top, they would be very, very tired, and then they would need to do tunnel fighting in order to conquer the dwarven underground cities, with tunnels that are made for dwarves, not for men or elves. And they even can't redirect rivers in order to flood underground halls, since they sit at the highest point of the landscape. And even then, in this most dire of circumstances, they could still fight from pre-prepared and well-defended choke points. And just after another ends, another one starts, which is nearly impossible to conquer, especially when under time pressure, because the real dwarven army is drawing nearer each and every day. And then there's this last thing to consider. The harsh mountain land that the dwarves inhabit wouldn't be very valuable to any other nation, even with all of the gold and ores inside of the mountains. It is still probably a lot cheaper just to buy whatever you need from the dwarves instead of taking it over, only to suffer from much higher production costs. Not to mention the costs of life, which will be excruciating, to put it mildly, that it would require to actually conquer their holds. And again, that's just the militia. Now we are going to take a look at how a proper dwarf army meant to lay siege to cities and conquer entire nations would actually look like. Well, first and foremost, every dwarf would be armed and armored in quite heavy armor, or at least medium armor, since dwarves in general are fairly slow. Light armor and skirmisher units don't really make a lot of sense, since they will be still slower than, let's say, the average human man, not to mention the average human soldier, almost every single time, unless they are fighting snail people or something like that. And even then, it would just be more effective to launch salt with catapults and trebuchets amongst the ranks. So the dwarves would essentially only have medium and heavy infantry among them. As for line breakers, they will likely use honor-less dwarves, equipped with the finest of weapons and the best of armor, to punch a hole into the enemy lines, or rather grind one into it. If the honorless dwarf win, he gets his honor back and is redeemed. If not, he dies with his honor intact and is fondly remembered by his peers. And I would even say so that these units will not only be voluntary, but also really tough to get in, because the reward for being in one is so high. So the people in it are actually eager to fight, and if necessary die gloriously in battle, something that a human peasant levy would not necessarily be as enthusiastic about. Furthermore, the dwarven army would also not use axes or pickaxes, maces or hammers as their main weapon, but the spear. The dwarven spears would be stronger and tougher and hardier than their human equivalent, and likely even a bit longer, since the center of mass of a dwarven spearman would be fairly close to the ground, thanks to the dwarf's size, and since dwarves are way heavier than men, especially in heavy armor, they could break any charge and would likely look like a Greek phalanx than, let's say, a medieval spearman, at least initially. And with that, they could defend against charges of cavalry, which would negate one of their greatest weaknesses, at least in part, if they can properly defend to all sides. Namely their low mobility, by simply making it incredibly hard to break through any dwarven unit, since most dwarves would wield spears or halberds or any other polearm. Additionally, dwarves would have one of the best archer corps in the entire fantasy world, since they are extremely strong and tough. Their bows can also be extremely strong and tough and have high poundage. Therefore, the range would be better, the damage higher, and they could possibly punch through some, if not most, armor. Surprisingly, they would not use crossbow units, since dwarf would just find it easier to use a strong bow than a crossbow, since the reload time would, especially for a dwarf, next to nothing, with years and practice and dedication. And now imagine hundreds of dwarven archers firing volley after volley of extra deadly, extra fast, extra heavy arrows before the human crossbowman or the human knight can even come into reach, come even close to the main front line. These blows would also be used to fell horses, or perhaps even lizards or drake riders, before they can reach the dwarven lines. Now, the question then is, why would they fight so defensively? What is their angle here? Why they are trying to defend instead of attacking even when they are on the offensive? Well, their artillery, of course, bombards, cannons, and anything else that goes boom would be their main argument for not provoking their wrath. And these boomers would be an incredible threat to any army and any city, since dwarven-made cannons would be so robust and sturdy, and have such a long range and carry such deadly ammunitions that any enemy force would be forced to attack or be wiped out over time. And even the cover of a forest would do no good if it's burning down. Now, of course, enemy casters could use water magic to put out the fire, or fire magic to control it, but against such things the dwarves have one great answer: sheer stubbornness and deep ammunition storages and quantities. Dwarves are far sturdier and stronger than humans, and they don't need to move very fast in order to be an effective army. So, in relation to the body weight and their armor and their other equipment, an additional cannonball or two, or if the dwarf is especially honorable, a barrel of black powder would not weigh down the average dwarf that much. So they could just fire more rounds than the casters have mana. And speaking of casters, this would be one of the main weaknesses of most dwarf armies, since their physical labor and their species disposition would make them generally substandard at magic, and whatever dwarves exist that can use magic, they might be very few numbers. So, outranging casters is the best way for a dwarf army to deal with them, and whatever magic units the dwarf have would likely be used with counter spells and dispelling enemy attacks in mind. And finally, the dwarves would have a very smart, very capable and very reliable scout force, because the biggest weakness of a dwarven army would be a surprise attack. If enemy casters, troops and beasts could get close to the dwarven army's core, if they could get so close that the artillery or the bowmen aren't going to do much anymore, because otherwise they would hit their own guys, then it is fairly likely that the dwarves would face a very bloody and very costly battle. And even a withdrawal would be extremely costly in lives and material, since they would need to abandon all of their ammunition, all of their artillery pieces, and even then, dwarves are kinda slow. So, most of them would likely be unable to flee. And that's where auxiliary units would come in order to cover these weaknesses. Anything that can control or even ride a burly beast would be welcome to join the army in exchange for valuable dwarven coin. Magic casters would also be very useful, and finally, light cavalry and skirmishers would be also basically just a foreign force in addition to the dwarves. They wouldn't produce such units themselves. Now they would recruit such units preferably from men and women that lived close to the dwarven holds, that are already familiar with the dwarves, that are somewhat reliant on dwarven weapons, on dwarven metalworking. Basically, the human population further down the mountain, as in shepherds, cattle drivers, and so on and so forth, especially people who can bring their own mounts, would be incredibly valuable and incredibly welcome, even if the mount in question is just a mule or a donkey. And again, they would prefer to recruit from the people around their mountains, people that are personally invested in the dwarven society and the continued existence of the dwarven holdings. As for good light infantry on foot, well, let's say that some dwarves educate people from the forest, the sons and daughters of hunters, in the art of smithing and metalworking. Well, they are now familiar with dwarves, and they will also likely know how to use a bow, so they would be excellent light units or auxiliary bowmen, for quickly repositioning them around the core of the tougher, more sturdier and longer ranged dwarven bowmen. And again, all of these people who are already familiar with dwarves would be seen as dwarf friendly, so they would be seen as more honorable and more reliable over, let's say, normal mercenaries, who of course would also have their place within the ranks of the dwarven army, but not to the greatest of extent, since dwarves would be a bit distrusting of any man whose loyalty can be bought. But since the dwarves have very deep pockets, it's unlikely that they could be outbidden. And these mercenaries would therefore still have a hard time switching sides, simply for lack of a better offer. And for if nothing else, because dwarves would hold a grudge for a very long time, if not their entire lives. And with that said, I will end this video. Thank you very much for watching, be sure to leave your thoughts and opinions down in the comment section, and to check out my video on the Dwarven Army in Overlord. And with that said, have a nice day.